Yeah, well, George Pusch came to New York, as best I can determine, in 1865. He was 18 years old, and I think he came from Bavaria in Germany. I think, too, that his folks had some money. He was accompanied by a fellow by the name of John Zellweger. They were close friends, and they were meat cutters. And for about 10 years, they worked their way from New York across the country to San Francisco, and I think that was a business they were involved in, because evidently both of them had saved up some money or had gotten money from their parents in Germany. In about 1874, George moved from San Francisco to Prescott, Arizona, and I think he intended to go to Phoenix, but he ended up here in Tucson in 1874. He also, about that time, prevailed upon John Zellweger to join him. I think John had gone to San Francisco, and he came on down to Tucson from San Diego. They located the Steampump Ranch, which is the ranch at Orico and First, where the old steam pump building was located. They established that ranch because water was close to the surface. Water's good there today. And they established or built a steam pump that was fired with mesquite to bring the water to the surface. In those days, of course, if you dug a well, you had to hand dig it. You didn't have equipment to dig a well. So ranches were always located where there was a water source. So they had found this ranch with a good water. And they, for a period of time, a long period of time, in fact, watered cattle that were brought to Tucson or Red Rock for shipment. The old timers in Pinal County would ship out of Red Rock or Tucson, and they'd bring their cattle to steam pump to water the night before, because it added weight to the cow. And old George and John Zellweger got 10 cents or 15 cents, I'm not sure, a cow. About that time, a 20-year-old girl from Drachenberg in Germany named Matilda came to Tucson to visit Zellweger's friend. We called her Aunt Sophie. Here she was, 20 years old, traveling across the ocean to Tucson, which was a dusty little town of about 3,000. And Matilda and George were married. George Pusch were married a year later. They were married, they had 9 children. The first children were twins, and they both died, but 7 survived. And my mother, Gertrude, was the oldest. And she lived to be almost 90 years old, dying in 1974. The steam pump was not the main ranch. They used that more as an overnight stop to travel from Tucson to Feldman, the Feldman Ranch. They had a home on Jackson Street in Tucson, about a block south of Broadway and west of Stone Avenue, part of the area that was demolished when they put in the community center. So they would travel from that home in a horse buggy to the Steampump Ranch, stay overnight, and then head to the Feldman Ranch in the San Pedro Valley. That area was called at that time the Antelope Plains, the area that they traversed from the steam pump to San Pedro. And my mother told me many times they had to stop the wagon to let the antelope go by. Also, my grandfather never carried a gun. And the Apaches lived not far from the ranch in the San Pedro, where the Aravaipa Canyon flowed into the San Pedro, which was close to the ranch. And those Apaches were always friends. In fact, some of them would commit crimes and so forth in other parts of the San Pedro Valley, but they never touched my grandfather, never cut a fence. And Mother told me that on occasions, driving from Steampump to the San Pedro, crossing the Antelope Plains, the Apaches would beat them and circle them. And I had two aunts, the youngest girls, who had long blonde hair. And the Apaches would reach over and rub their hands through their hair. They were really interested in those women with the long blonde hair. And my grandfather would say, "Don't, just leave them alone. Don't get upset with it." But they never really bothered him, and they were really help on the ranch. My dad was Henry William Zipf, and married to Gertrude, the oldest daughter. And I lived out there on that ranch for 2 years. And we had a one-room schoolhouse. And we didn't have any of the niceties you have today. You got up in the morning at daylight and you went to bed at night. The only heat we had a large ranch house with a porch all around it. And the only heat we had were a couple fireplaces and little kerosene stoves and a big stove in the kitchen. And of course, food wasn't that available, no ice or anything like that. But it was an interesting time. I spent 2 years there as a kid, went to a one-room schoolhouse. We had a teacher by the name of Kirkpatrick from Winkleman, who taught the one room with kids in there from the 1st to the 8th grade. It was a real experience. The Apaches had a camping spot in the Catalinas above the old, above the steam pump. I say camping because I used to go up there a lot as a kid, my brother and I, and we'd find all kinds of pottery. But there wasn't anything to indicate that they had any permanent residence. And I think they were hunters who came through and maybe spent a few days up there. And my mother told me that on a number of occasions, they'd show up at the house, the kitchen door of the ranch house at the steam pump, and ask for food or maybe provisions. And the cook would always mumble and groan, but my grandmother would say, "Take care of them. We don't want any problems." And so she'd see that they had sugar and salt, whatever else they asked for. And so they got along with the Apaches. Never seemed to have any trouble. My grandfather was active in politics. He was a member of the legislature when the state was still a territorial legislature. And later, he was a member of the Constitutional Convention that drew the Constitution for the state of Arizona. And he was also on the council in Tucson. The only thing about my grandfather, he was a Republican. And in those days, Republicans didn't get very far in elections. The registration was about 4 or 5 to 1 Democrat. Many of the people that were in that Constitutional Convention with him became governor. Moe Udall's grandfather was there as a delegate. There was a fellow by the name of Hunt, who was governor for 6 times, another Democrat. I remember him because he looked like a walrus. He had this big mustache. What Osborne, another Democrat, became governor. So it was quite a gathering of prominent people in Arizona at that time. My mother spent a lot of time at the Steampump. She loved it out there. And prospectors would come to the Steampump to water their burros and to get provisions to go into the Catalinas. And she learned from them about a mine called the Mine with the Iron Door. It was supposed to be a mine up there in the Catalinas above the ranch where this old prospector had found a fabulous vein. So these fellows would come in with these burros and they'd load up to head up into that part of the Catalinas. The Catalinas did have some mining. There was a mine on the other side of the Catalinas, up near the top of the mountain. And there was also mining in the Canada Del Oro up near Oracle, quite a bit. In fact, there's a mine there today. But these old prospectors headed up into the hills. I don't think they ever found anything, although you can go up there now and you can find holes. The Canada Del Oro country is really a beautiful area. And my dad used to take me out there at one spot where he'd go down into the canyon and pan for gold. And there were miners down there in there working. And he'd get colors, but they never got anything very big. Although I think during the Depression, some people made enough money to get along. It was in 1922, I think. Harold Bell Wright came to Tucson. Harold Bell Wright had tuberculosis, and he came here for his health, as many people did in that time. He built one of the first subdivisions out off of Speedway in Wilmot and had a beautiful home out there. And that subdivision exists today. Anyway, he would stop at the Steampump Ranch, and he and my mother became great friends. And she told him about the mine with the Iron Door. So he learned about this fabulous mine, and later met with George Wilson up at Oracle to ask him to provide a spot for him to go where he could be by himself and try and recover from his illness. George Wilson owned the Linda Vista Guest Ranch. It wasn't a guest ranch then. He owned the Linda Vista Ranch. He came to Oracle originally for his health. He'd had some kind of problem too with his lungs. And he established this ranch there at near Oracle. And he allowed Harold Bell Wright, or permitted Harold Bell Wright to go up to an old line camp on the Canada Del Oro where he'd be alone, be able to be there and try and regain his health. And he had an old fellow there at the ranch he'd send up to the line shack with provisions. So Harold Bell Wright had food and that type of thing. But he's up there for about 6 months. During that period, he wrote The Mine with the Iron Door. And it was very popular. And Principal Picture Corporation in Hollywood decided they wanted to film it. And he agreed that they could film the picture provided they filmed it at the Linda Vista Guest Ranch, because he wanted to repay old George Wilson for the help he'd given him. So they filmed it there. And in order to accommodate all the extras, movie actresses, and so forth, George had to build some cottages. Well, when they got through with the filming the picture, he had these cottages at his ranch, and he decided that he'd start the guest ranch. And he started Linda Vista Guest Ranch, which was the first, really the first guest ranch in Arizona. The Canada Del Oro, where the Linda Vista Guest Ranch is beautiful. The stream usually ran, and you look back into the Catalinas, there's a trail goes all the way to the top of the mountain from the ranch on the backside. And there's all kinds of game in there, and it was, of course, it was isolated. So people from all over the country came to the Linda Vista Guest Ranch, and people like the actresses, Rita Hayworth, Gary Cooper, I guess Clark Abel, yeah, and also prominent politicians. Herb Brownell, who was Attorney General of the United States, Vice President Dawes, and Boyd Wilson, who was a good friend of mine. George Wilson's son told me that Dewey came out there after he was defeated by Truman. And I bring up the Linda Vista Guest Ranch because other guests came to that guest ranch and later bought ranches in the area. They included Walter McDonald of the McDonald Press in Cleveland. He owned Rancho Vistosa, the whole ranch. He had a house right down here after you cross the Cañada on Orica Road. He had a big home back in there. Another guest was Joe McAdams, and he owned all of Rancho Romero. And Roberta Nicholas of the Johnston Pharmaceutical Company owned land up there, ranch up there where Catalinas is today. So the Linda Vista Guest Ranch brought these prominent people to this area. In 1933, Jack Proctor, who ran the Pioneer Hotel in Tucson, and I think probably had an interest in it, bought the Steampump Ranch from my grandmother's estate for $10,000. Jack Proctor was a prominent man in Tucson. He was he was on the board of the Consolidated Bank, active in civic affairs. He had a daughter, Betty, who was a beautiful woman, long red hair, was Miss Arizona at one time, and she had a shop there. And she married Hank Lieber. Hank Lieber went to the University of Arizona, where he played football and baseball, and later became a member of the New York Giants. And I think he was also on the Cub team. Hank Lieber married Betty Proctor, and they moved to the old Steampump Ranch house after Proctor had bought the property. Proctor also built himself a home adjacent to the old ranch houses. So Hank and Betty lived out there in the old Steampump house, the house that my grandfather had built, and they fixed it up real nice. It was a nice place. We spent a lot of happy times out there. Hank would bring in the whole Cleveland ball team and cook steaks, and they all loved that area because of its proximity to the mountains and the beauty of the area. Jack Proctor would take his favorite guests out to the ranch. In fact, some of them stayed out there. And one of his guests was Francis Rooney from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Francis Rooney was the president of the Manhattan Construction Company in Tulsa, and they had other interests in Tulsa. And Francis became interested in the adjoining ranch. Now, that ranch I think they called Canada Del Oro Ranch. So he purchased that, and it included all of the property that's now occupied by the Oro Valley estates and the golf course and the land across the Canada. He had a cowboy on the ranch named Pancho Mendoza, and old Pancho ran cattle on the property and was a caretaker. Also, my uncle, George Pusch, son of George Pusch Jr., I guess, would occupy the home on the ranch, on the Canada Del Oro Ranch. They had an old home there, adobe home, built big thick walls, big home. He'd occupy that as a caretaker for the benefit of the Rooney family. In 1958, Rooney sold a portion of the Canada Del Oro Ranch to a fellow by the name of Jerry Timon, who afterwards organized the Horizon Land Company. A fellow by the name of Lou Landon, who was from Chicago, had been out looking at the property because he was interested in establishing a golf course. There were only 2 or 3 in Tucson at the time, and this area out here was isolated. There wasn't really anything much in the Oro Valley area. The dirt road, I think a fellow by the name of I forget his name, but he had some chickens on Linda Vista, chicken shacks, and a couple ranches, but nothing else out here. Well, anyway, Lou Landon prevailed upon Jerry Timon to sell him 175 acres for $187,000. I handled the deal for Lou, and part of the requirement in the sale was that he build a golf course within a certain period of time, because Timon recognized that if they built the golf course there, it would increase the value of his property. So Lou had about 15, 16 Chicago investors. They all came out from time to time, and they invested enough money for him to buy the property and build that golf course. Property out here then was, like I say, ranches. And I think zoning was 4 acres to a house. The Oro Valley estates called for acre zoning for each house. So we had to go before the Board of Supervisors to get the property rezoned. And they held Timon and Landon held a news conference at the Saddle and Sirloin restaurant on Oracle Road. Press was there, and they unveiled this new project out here in Oro Valley. They suggested that there was going to be all kinds of developments, lakes, golf courses, tennis courts, a big deal. The Star came out the next day and said, with headlines, $44 million investment in Oro Valley. Proctor died a number of years ago, and he left the Steampump Ranch to his grandsons, Henry and John. Henry has a ranch up in Montana, and John's a lawyer here in Tucson.
John live on the ranch?
Yeah, John lives on the ranch. And until about a couple years ago, Betty Lieber died, but Henry Lieber occupied the old ranch house until his death. Tom Mix spent his time at the Santa Rita. He loved the Santa Rita. And the day he left, everybody tried to stop him from leaving. They were worried because he'd been drinking. And he loved to drive a fast car. And it happened that that day, I was working with a citizen. And part of my job was to deliver papers to Casa Grande, Coolidge, and Florence. And I was coming back the Florence Highway. And I got there about the time, maybe half an hour after he had run off the road and killed himself. They were putting in a new culvert. And he was going so fast he couldn't control his car. And I guess he rolled. And it was in the afternoon. He'd left the Santa Rita and was on his way to, I guess, California.